morning, good evening. Welcome back to the Which Carolina podcast. I have a amazing guest today, Richie Randall, co-host of the Buzzbeat Pod. He is here in the flesh. The big R is behind him. If you're listening via audio version, I think that got a good bit of traction on the internet. Your exchange with Devontae. I don't think you've updated the batteries yet, though, Richie.
No, I have. I can turn them on for you real quick. I'm trying to save them because I guess this thing just runs out pretty quickly. So I'll turn it on for you.
There we go. Now, yeah, we're gonna get it all lit up. Um, but
Maybe you can't see it. Maybe you can't see it. They're dim.
That's awesome. Yeah. So Richie, our audience is pretty NBA heavy, definitely very Hornets niche. So to get the chance to have you on, we really just appreciate you joining us, taking some time out. And I think it'll be really informative for the audience as we move out of this 4-game preseason into the season opener next week. I wanted to start before we dive right into Hornet stuff. Just curious kind of on your path within the sports media world, and then also just how did you become interested in the Hornets? Have you been a fan for a long time? Kind of those two questions coupled together.
Okay. Yeah. So I was actually born in '88. That was the year that the franchise was awarded to Charlotte. And just with it being so popular at the time, obviously I don't remember the early days or the early games, but my parents clearly dressed me up in Hornets gear. They got me a Muggsy Bogues jersey when I was young, the Larry Johnson jersey when I was young. And that franchise was just so huge for the city because it was the only professional sports team in Charlotte. And so for as long as I can remember, I was just a Hornets fan, basketball fan. I went to several games at the Hive, the Coliseum, where they had like 8 straight years of like the top attendance in the NBA. So that's kind of where it started, just my love of sports or love of basketball. I was no good at like baseball or football. I tried those sports out. I was no good at those. I lasted all of one day in football. I was like, okay, I'm out. This is not for me. So yeah, both of those things, just kind of interested in the game, interested in the Hornets. And kind of as, I was going through my schooling, I realized at a young age I was not becoming an NBA player. So I've always like been interested in just analyzing the game and just watching it, for fun, but also watching it for like the intricacies of the game. So I actually went to UNCW to get my communication studies degree because I felt like that would lead to a path in some kind of media world in the sports world. But as everyone knows, it's a very competitive field. So I tried to get in, try to get my foot in the door, but I had to go back to school to get my teaching degree so that I can actually make some money. But on the side, I was just, blogging. I went to Queen City Hoops, I think back in like 2016. And then from there, probably, I don't know, 6 months into it, Spencer Percy, who also wrote for Queen City Hoops, he came to me with the idea. I was like, hey, do you want to do a podcast? And I was like, yeah, of course. I actually kind of prefer podcasting versus writing. Not that I'm a bad writer. I just feel like it takes a little bit more time. You know what I mean? It feels like, there's prep for podcasts, but it just seems like writing, I sat there, I just like overanalyzed. It's like, oh, should I put this sentence here, this paragraph here? It just took too much of my time up. So it was easier to kind of have that side hustle of the podcast. We've been going strong for about 4 years, 3.5, 4 years now. And then we brought on Brian Geisinger, who was a guest of your show. And it's only picked up steam over the course of the 4 years that we've had it. I know this is a long answer, but then recently, I've been able to, have media access to the games or to, I guess, virtual games. So that's been pretty cool as well. So that's kind of been my journey as a Hornets fan and covering this team as well.
That's awesome. So a couple things. One, and we'll circle back at the end again as well, but the Buzzbeat Pod, it's tough to find Hornet-centric content, and you guys do an unbelievable job of covering the team. And it's been cool to see now you kind of starting to weave in the media access, the interviews with Borrego, all that good stuff. So for Hornets fans that are at times starved for content, definitely check out the Buzzbeat Pod because it's a great place not only to learn about the team, but just to hear some guys banter about NBA basketball and the Hornets in general, which is nice. I think your story about how you became a Hornets fan will be very relatable for a lot of our audience, frankly. It's relatable for me as a kid who grew up in Charlotte in the 90s as well, going to the old Charlotte Coliseum. My dad, was at the game where Alonzo Mourning hit the shot against the Celtics.
Wow.
Yeah, I was a little, he says that's the loudest moment in an arena he's ever heard in his life. And he's been to a lot of games. So, going out to that old Coliseum where there was one way in and one way out of the parking lot. I mean, great memories though, because that building was fantastic. And those are some really good teams. So I just think there'll be a lot of Charlotte Hornets fans that can relate and be like, yep, I remember wearing the teal and going to that arena way outside of town and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead and dive in. So really what I wanted to do, just to kind of frame the conversation for the audience, is kind of give where we are and where we've been. So I've essentially kind of been calling this like our post Kemba Walker journey, right? After Kemba leaves town, it's essentially a tear down and a rebuild to a degree, right? This time last off season, which feels like a decade ago now, we had no idea that Devontae Graham was going to kind of evolve into this real NBA playmaker on the ball, right? And we really weren't sure what we were getting in Terry Rozier. I believe he's kind of morphed into a pretty valuable asset on the contract that he's on with the way he's shooting the ball. We didn't know that PJ Washington was going to be like a starter made ready rookie. So, before this last offseason, I think a lot of people expected the Hornets to win maybe less than 20 games. They certainly outperformed last year, I think, a little bit under James Borrego. They were 23-42. From an offensive and defensive rating standpoint, they were down towards the bottom of the league last year. 28th in offensive rating, 25th in defensive rating, 27th in net rating. So essentially, they have punched above their weight, from a advanced statistics standpoint. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that JB kind of runs this team and the way they share the ball. And just real quickly, before I turn it over back to you for kind of some general offseason thoughts. Key departures for Hornets fans that are just getting up to speed before the season starts. Michael Kidd-Gilchrist was bought out prior to the trade deadline. Same with Marvin Williams. Nicholas Batum is now out of town after stretching his contract to bring in Gordon Hayward. Willie Hernan-Gomez and Dwayne Bacon. Key additions basically is Gordon Hayward and re-signing Bismack. And then, of course, the draft picks, LaMelo Ball, Vernon Carey Jr., Nick Richards. What was the most interesting part of the offseason to you? How did you just kind of generally feel about the moves the Hornets made broadly? And what have been your thoughts on kind of this new regime and this new coaching staff?
Okay, I'll actually answer your last question first and then get to the offseason. Yeah. And in terms of this new coaching staff, clearly JB was brought in to be this player development coach. That was like the key buzzword that they kept throwing around. And part of the issue was he came in his first year and Kemba Walker was still on the team. So, to really fully go with the player development route, while your team has Kemba Walker, you're going to be pushing for the playoffs. So the young guys on that roster at during his first season probably didn't get the exposure on the court that maybe he wanted them to have. So it really, last season was his first season. It felt like he was actually kind of, imparting his philosophies on the team and kind of working his way with the player development piece. So I'm fully on board with James Borrego. I know some people don't necessarily are not as high on him as I am. I think we do have to give it time. Despite some of the numbers last year, like you said, bottom 5 in offense and defense, he was getting the team on the spots on the court that he wanted to. Like if you were to look at the locations that the Hornets were shooting at, they were getting to the rim. They were limiting the mid-range shot. They were shooting from behind the arc as well. Obviously, they were not converting them at a rate that he wanted them to. But again, half of that, has to deal with some talent that goes on there. So, last season, I was pleasantly surprised with a lot of players, like you mentioned, like Terry Rozier. He was a surprise off-ball player, very much in the upper tier and catch and shoot 3-point attempts. Devontae Graham was a surprise on the scene. I think that he probably should have received more recognition with the most improved voting. I think eventually teams kind of caught on to the over reliance on Graham, and they started to trap him. So when he sat, that was definitely an issue. And then, like you mentioned, PJ Washington definitely showed some flashes of a versatile game where he could play inside out or outside in. But like I said, the shot profile is exactly what JB was asking for. In terms of the acquisitions or the departures, yeah, I mean, I think I actually was not expecting a whole lot of movement in terms of the acquisitions, but then that sign and trade with Gordon Hayward came out of nowhere, and then that forced the Hornets to stretch Batum. So in terms of players that we lost, I guess there's really nobody of consequence in terms of like making a huge effect on the team.
Agreed.
Now, if you want to consider Marvin Williams a departure, even though he departed, mid-season, he would be an awesome veteran presence in this locker room, a good communicator on defense. He was able to knock down that three-point shot. He could even play out of the post as well. Yep. But I totally understand why he retired and everything like that. But I was not expecting a ton of movement in the offseason. Gordon Hayward just came out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was quite a surprise. I think everyone's, when the Woj tweet came across the timeline, it was like, all right, drop everything. What is going on right now? And obviously everyone is hoping that he can get back on the court, hopefully by the season opener. I know we don't really know exactly when he'll be back now, but to your point, I think James Borrego and the staff have been pretty fantastic. Yes, we will have to figure out if he is able to kind of get this young core to the next level. But in terms of getting the most out of a roster, I don't think you could ask a whole lot more for what he did at the helm last year with all these young guys. Kind of rotating into your point about Devonte Graham. So last year, when he was on the floor, the Hornets scored 114 points per 100 possessions, which is basically like a league average offense. So when Devonte Graham played last year and he was on the floor, the Hornets were pretty decently efficient offensively. When he goes off the court last year, 98 points per 100 possessions, which for NBA fans that don't quite understand the advanced numbers, like that is horrific. I mean, you could put me and Richie and a couple halfway decent shooters out there, and we might be able to score that many points. So I guess my overall point here is when Devonte Graham was on the bench last year, the offense completely cratered. In your opinion and in your mind, does having LaMelo Ball now in the second unit, and then also having Gordon Hayward as kind of a wing facilitator that can have the ball in his hands, that can kind of calm things down and direct offense if he needs to, do you feel like those issues have been mostly alleviated through some of the draft picks and acquisitions?
Yeah, I mean, going back to the acquisitions, the two major acquisitions, Gordon Hayward and LaMelo Ball this offseason, feels like that could help with some of the facilitating, some of the playmaking, because, yeah, I mean, the offense was very hard to watch when he wasn't on the court. The team struggled to generate open looks from three. When he was on the court, he kind of created that gravity, and people gravitated towards him, and that allowed some of the bigs and wings to score at the rim. It allowed some of our quote unquote shooters to shoot from behind the arc. It just feels like a lot of the important stuff went up when he was on the court, right? Like assist rate, field goal percentage at the rim, all that type of stuff. So yes, in theory, I think Ball and Hayward will give Borrego more opportunities to kind of mix and match lineups. He's not going to feel like if he sits Devonte Graham that the ability to score is going to totally crater. Yes, I mean, this Hornets team was still bottom five, like I said, in offense, but having the ability to have more playmakers is always a good thing. And that's probably a big reason why the Hornets did struggle without Devonte. I mean, Malik Monk is a playmaker, but other than that, there was not many playmakers on this team. And it's gonna, we're gonna spread the love around a little bit more, and we're not gonna over rely on Devonte and his pick and roll game. So yeah, I do love those two acquisitions of Hayward and Ball. It's kind of unfortunate, right now with Gordon, because we're kind of in limbo waiting on his status. It feels like, he's always unlucky with these injuries, but he is going to do a lot for this Hornets team. Like you said, he's a veteran guy that's going to play make, and he's solid defensively as well. I think people don't realize that about him. He's not going to lock anyone down, but he's just always is in the right place.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think, to your point and that conversation, like it also puts Terry Rozier in a situation where he's almost always correctly cast now. You don't necessarily have to depend on him to play make with the ball in his hands for others as much now with Hayward and Ball. He can really live and exist off the ball and hunt jump shots. And like you pointed to earlier, he was a top 5 catch and shoot guy, especially above the break, anywhere not in the corner. I mean, his jump shot efficiencies from 3 were pretty eye popping last year. Um, in kind of the same vein, and I know it's only 4 preseason games so far. It's a very it's tough to draw conclusions from that, but structurally, you kind of hinted at the fact that last year the Hornets really, to score, they had to just put Devontae in pick and roll over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing a major change, at least thus far, from a structural standpoint offensively? And so kind of curious on your opinion on that. And then also, has Borrego, has he talked much about that in regards to if they're going to play differently offensively? I know they've picked up the pace a little bit.
Yeah, well, we'll start with there first. I mean, I think last season it was hard to pick up the pace because they were such a bad defensive rebounding. They might have been last in the league in terms of grabbing defensive rebounds and allowing opponents to grab, I think, like 30% of their missed shots. But yeah, it feels, again, it's 4 games. It feels like the offense is more spread out. They're not having Devontae Graham bring the ball up the court every single time. And it just seems it's less predictable. So with pushing the pace, Borrego has talked about having confidence in Miles, having confidence in PJ, of just grabbing it and going. And you'll see, LaMelo take the ball up. You'll see Rozier take the ball up from time to time. Although, to your point, he's not necessarily someone that you would want kind of playmaking with those other playmakers on the court. Depending on Hayward's status, he's going to be doing the same thing. And it seems like the offense, yes, it is not reliant on the pick and roll. It's more spread out. You can see Devontae running off some screens. And Borrego has talked about that, where it makes it less predictable and it gives more options out on the court. Did you have another question? What was the other question? I forgot.
Yeah, no, it was basically just around that. From a structural standpoint, it's a little bit less static, pick and roll heavy. It seems to be a little bit more free flowing motion, at least what we've seen so far. We've got to talk about LaMelo Ball, right? It is what it is. I've been pleasantly optimistic on his play in the preseason. Now, he's shooting 26% from the floor on about 10 attempts per game, and he's shooting 27% from 3 on about 5 attempts a game. So the offensive efficiency is subpar, but I think that's to be expected so far. And but the playmaking and the advanced passing is kind of already shining through and already translating basically immediately. What's been your take on his kind of Jekyll and Hyde preseason as he, as a 19-year-old, tries to integrate himself onto this roster and find his footing as an NBA playmaker?
Yeah, I'll be the first to say I wasn't high on LaMelo. Not that I don't deny his talent. Like, I think that he was very a talented player coming into this draft, and most would argue that he's the most talented player coming into this draft. But I just was a little bit skeptical of how it would turn out on the NBA level. Maybe it's just the last name that kind of threw me off. But yeah, I mean, after watching him for 4 games, we clearly see that he is a playmaker. He's going to go through some ups and downs as a rookie, just like any rookie would. But you definitely see something special in his passing, and it unlocks some things offensively for the Hornets. You surround him with shooters. You surround him with a pick and roll threat like PJ, or put him in a pick and roll with Cody, and you can see them, diving to the rim, and it forces the defense to make a decision. And the good news about Ball is that really not even just among rookies, among NBA players, he's able to thread a needle that's so tight. And he will see people that are open that maybe others wouldn't. And, regardless of age or experience, he has that's going to be able to translate right away. Now, in terms of the question marks, some of the same question marks that we thought of heading into the career of LaMelo Ball are showing right now. His shot has not been falling. I think partially is the form, but he just needs more consistency in that form, more reps. I think he is going to be a better player shooting off the ball, at least initially, even though he does like to play with the ball in his hands. He hit a couple of corner threes in the preseason so far. And then another question mark of mine is his on-ball defense and that frame that he has and fighting through the pick and rolls, because he's going to be put through a lot of pick and rolls as a defender. So, the passing translates right away. And then the question marks that we heard of are clearly showing as a rookie, but he's going to go through ups and downs like any rookie would. So,
yeah, I think you're spot on in regards to, I worry about the point of attack defense. He shows some defensive instincts, like running to the right place sometimes in scramble situations, getting his hands into the passing lanes. He has some anticipation. But I totally echo your concerns about just him getting put in pick and roll after pick and roll against second unit point guards could be pretty tough for him as a rookie. So here's a question for you from a lineup standpoint, and I'd be curious what your insight is from maybe if Borrego's answered any questions from the media on this. How often do you think he would be willing to play PJ at the 5? So kind of that, I guess, in vogue small ball lineup, if you want to call it. I mean, if you look last year, PJ played at the 5 about 360 possessions, which isn't a ton. And the Hornets were -12, in those minutes, but it was more of a defensive disaster than it was offensive. They were actually fairly efficient offensively with PJ at the 5. So now that PJ's got another year under his belt, and he'll be a more experienced player, do you see that as a reasonable option for lineup configuration, or do you think that Coach Borrego will really lean towards always kind of having a more traditional center on the floor with Zeller and Bismack, or maybe even one of the young guys if they can come along?
Right. I think everything that we're hearing this offseason from Borrego, he is talking about playing him at the 5 clearly more frequently than he did last year. I think he's very willing to do that. And I think it fits with the way that JB wants to play, more spread out, more versatility. Not that Cody isn't versatile, but he's getting up there in age, and it just feels like PJ is the prototypical small ball 5. And if you look at the numbers last season, like you said, they're not as good as people maybe make it out to be. I think everyone's was clamoring for PJ at the 5. It's like, well, if you actually looked at the numbers, it really wasn't that great with him at the 5. Now, he has struggled this preseason. I think he's one of the few players on this roster where you're just watching and you're just like, it's not flowing for him. It's not clicking. There's a couple of things that have been going wrong with him. He's been missing some bunnies at the rim. He's been blown by on defense for a handful of possessions. And, I don't know if that's directly correlated to his new role by any means. I think it's more of like a mentality and locking in and making sure that you're ready to play. And I don't know how much stock you want to put into preseason play. Some players just might not get up for preseason as they may for the regular season. But I think JB is very willing to play PJ at the 5. He sees PJ as a playmaker despite his struggles this preseason. He continues to state, he actually stated it last night after the 4th preseason game, that he's a believer in PJ. He thinks PJ is going to be something special. So he's going to have to play through these, ups and downs as a small ball 5. And I think one thing that you are seeing that he's allowing PJ to grab that rebound and go. And he's been a little bit erratic with some of his decision-making, driving the ball off of a rebound, and he's lost the ball a couple of times, just not strong with the ball. Like he just has gotten the ball taken from him on a couple of drives. But it's funny. I actually had PJ's dad on our podcast, I think back in January. And I talked about, just seeing some of those guard skills that you see out of PJ. And I've made this comment before, obviously on Buzz Beat, but his dad said that he always played PJ up a couple levels. So instead of being a big guy, he was now more of like a guard, and it forced him to play out on the perimeter. So you can kind of see some of those things today because his dad was playing him up a couple of age groups. So I think it can work. He has the ability to make it work. And I think Borrego is going to try to make sure that he gets some more minutes at 5. But just kind of viewing preseason, regardless if he's playing at 5 or 4, he just doesn't seem to be clicking right now. And hopefully he can get that turned around.
Yeah, I'm hoping so too. I mean, he obviously hasn't made any shots really in the preseason. I think as the shooting comes around, hopefully so will the rest of his game. And to kind of the point about, lineup flexibility and versatility, I think having Hayward around also gives you more slack, if you will, kind of on playing PJ at the 5, because Hayward is so versatile defensively. So I hope we see it a good bit too. I think it's a very interesting wrinkle to watch this year. I've been kind of preaching to Hornets fans on Twitter and on the podcast that let's not be so concerned with what the starting lineup is. Let's be a little bit more concerned with who's out there finishing games for the Charlotte Hornets. Obviously, in the preseason, you're not going to see the regular finishing group finish games.
Right.
Who do you think, and I know this is speculative at best, but if you had to guess, I mean, do you think there is a solid finishing group? Maybe it obviously kind of depends on the game and the matchups within that game. Has Borrego talked about that much? How do you see that playing out?
He's not really talked about it that much. I think this could be a cop-out answer, but I think whoever has the hot hand, he's going to go with. And I feel like that's what he did last season as well. That was the philosophy that Charlotte took. And, if you're playing well in the third and fourth quarter, you're probably going to see some minutes down the stretch. And to be honest with you, when you asked this question, I was trying to think of like some combinations that would work or ones that I'd be interested in seeing out on the court. But I really keep going back to the starting lineup that they put out there. I mean, I know to your point, you should not focus on the starting lineup so much or get so hung up on the starters because in the end, it only matters who finishes the game. So if there are some deficiencies with some of these starters, obviously you can finish the game with someone that might bring more energy or just allows for more playmaking or shooting, what have you. But I keep going back to Devontae, Rozier, Hayward, PJ, and Zeller. Like that's the group that I feel most confident and most comfortable in finishing games. Now, if you wanted to get a little bit more creative or more small ball heavy there, maybe you can put Bridges in for Zeller. You know what I mean? And have a lineup of Devontae, Rozier, Hayward, Bridges, and PJ. Now, I know a lot of LaMelo fans might be clamoring, hey, where's LaMelo in all this? Yeah, I mean, his name would also be brought up, but I think he's not that he's easier to take out of games, but because he is a rookie, he's going to go through more rough patches. But I just look at that starting lineup that they've been using for these 4 preseason games. You have Devontae, who adds playmaking and shooting. You have Rozier, who can shoot off the catch. And we actually can't forget, he was actually the most clutch 3-point shooter last year on Charlotte's roster. You have Hayward, who can bring some playmaking, a veteran presence. PJ adds that versatility, and Zeller's that screen setter, that glue guy that holds everything together. He's a scrappy player. So I keep going back to that starting 5. But I feel like that's a cop-out answer.
No, I think honestly that's super informative, and you hit on a couple points that I was going to bring up. For Charlotte Hornet lineups last season that played over 75 possessions, so not counting some of these lineups that only played like 30 possessions. To your point, Devontae Graham, Terry Rozier, Bridges, PJ Washington, Cody Zeller. That was really the only lineup over 75 possessions that had even a decent net rating. So if you plug in Gordon Hayward for Miles Bridges, that seems to make a little bit of sense to me for those closing lineups. I've also always kind of heard coaches say, at the end of games, give me my 5 most competitive guys, which I think that plays very well into that. Yes, you could take Bridges out of that lineup and substitute Miles and Hayward if you wanted to play PJ at the 5. Mm-hmm. And to the point that you just hit on, the Charlotte Hornets were incredible in clutch time last season. Clutch time is basically defined by the NBA as a 5-point game within the last 5 minutes of a game. And to your point about PJ, he shot 60% from the field, 50% from three in clutch time last year. Rozier and Graham also were magnificent in clutch time last year. So it just feels like those three are going to have to be on the floor to close games. And I don't know how willing Borrego is going to be to play all three guards at the same time. You haven't seen that a ton yet in the preseason, although maybe he'll experiment with it a little. You saw very limited lineups last year of Monk, Rozier, and Devontae. So I think it's going to be fascinating because the Hornets were so good late in games last year, and that was part of the reason why they were able to punch above their weight from an advanced standpoint. So I don't think that was a cop out. I think that was actually super informative for fans who are trying to figure out, who's going to be the group that can try to win games for this team at the end.
Yeah, I just feel like you shouldn't be creative or kind of be cute just to be cute. You know what I mean?
Totally agree. Like, get the guys out there that can get the job done. So, and just due to all this this, I would say, newfound versatility and lineup flexibility that Borrego all of a sudden now has. I mean, we haven't even talked about the Martin twins and Jaden McDaniels. He can be a little more liberal and a little more experimentative, I think, this season. Before we get out, wanted to run by just a couple things to see if there's any new information out there or maybe how you're viewing it. Devontae Graham extension, is there any new information out there on that, or how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, there's not any new information, and obviously that has to be done by the 22nd before the NBA season starts. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but to my knowledge, he could receive a 4-year deal, I think north of I can't remember the numbers in front of me, but I think the deal is more than fair for the Hornets. I feel like the Hornets would do that in a heartbeat. But I almost wonder if Graham is going to bank on himself and try to get more next offseason. It's a two-way street. So if the Hornets want to do it, but Graham is like, hey, I'll take my chances next year in the offseason and see what happens. So yeah, there's not been any updates on that. I almost feel like it's not going to get done. And then Malik Monk as well. He's up for an extension. I think that one actually has a smaller chance of getting done. It just feels like, Malik can't catch a break between, the drug suspension and now COVID. He's behind the 8 ball as well. So this seems like a prove it year for Malik. And if Devontae Graham wants to, test himself here this season and improve him as well, he can obviously make more than maybe his extension would be. So it's going to be an interesting decision with the Hornets, but I think as of now, there's probably not going to be an extension with either of those players.
Yep. That seems to be the writing on the wall, right? And I get it. Like you said, I think the Hornets would do it in a heartbeat if they could with Devontae Graham. But I also understand, a player who was a second-round pick and who exploded onto the scene as an NBA playmaker and a shooter last year. I get it if he wants to play things out. Sure, he might be taking on a little bit of risk, not signing a longer-term deal, but he's young enough, so I understand it. The last one I wanted to ask you about was Cody Zeller, who's playing in a contract year. It seems like the buyout would be probably not the way they would go, just because I feel like they need Cody Zeller to be competitive as thin as they are at the center position. I guess certainly they could trade him if there was like a contender who felt like some center depth would put them over the edge. And then you start looking at kind of a potential re-sign. Derek Favors got 3 years, 29. Plumlee got 3 years, 24. Jakob Poeltl got 3 years, 26. So I'm not comparing him necessarily to those players. I just trying to figure out what his value might be. You think Cody Zeller's back next year? A guy who's been with the Hornets?
Oh man, to be honest, I love Cody Zeller. I would love to see him back. Clearly, like I said, he's getting up there in age. I think, if he does start to play well, I think it'd be wise to kind of get some feelers out there to see if there's a trade market for him. I still do wonder how much Charlotte could actually get back for him, or if there's really much of a market for him. And to your point, I definitely wouldn't buy him out. I think, buyouts are obviously you're trying to do right by the player, get them on a contending team. But to be honest with you, I'd rather hold on to Zeller and let him walk for nothing in the offseason than go that buyout route, because like you said, we are a little bit thin in the center position, even though we drafted two centers with Carey and Richard, or traded for Richards, if you want to really get specific there. But yeah, the center position is thin in terms of actual productive players this season. So I would hold on to Zeller. Clearly, you would have to do your homework and see if there's anything out there for him. I'm not sure what you can get back. But if there is a chance that you can bring Zeller back, for 3 years, 3 more years, I don't think that that's a bad move by any means.
Yeah, I'd love to have him back on a favorable contract. Okay, before we get you out of here, just a couple quick kind of rapid fire questions. Realistic expectations for the season. Where do you see the Hornets stacking up in the East? Do you see them more as a potential play-in tournament type team, or do you think they can actually get in there and kind of compete for the 7th or 8th seed?
I think it's more likely that they're going to be in that play-in spot than obviously the 7th or 8th seed. I could see them getting close to that 8th seed, but in my eyes, if I had to put money on it, I feel like they're going to be battling for that 11th, 12th spot, which is right outside that play-in spot. You have what do we have? Like the Cavaliers, the Knicks. I feel like those are the two teams that I'm like confident in saying that Charlotte will, finish above. And then you also got the Pistons, the Bulls as well. So they're going to be towards, that 11 or 12 range. Can they make it to the play-in game? I would say yes. But if I had to put money on it, I would say they finish 11th in the East. That's my prediction.
Yeah, I think that that'll rub the most optimistic of the Hornets fans the wrong way, but I think it's honestly just a fairly realistic perspective. Do I give them a small chance of kind of catching lightning in a bottle, and competing for the 8th spot? I don't think it's completely out of the question, but like we talked about earlier, from just kind of their numbers on the whole last year, it would take a lot of improvement, and the teams around us have improved too, so it's going to be tough. Last question for you before we get you out of here. Is there a key player development storyline that maybe you're watching this season? Obviously, we've spoken about just about all of the talented and intriguing young players the Hornets have, and the lineup flexibility that affords this coaching staff. If you had to singular out like one guy, is there someone you're specifically interested in watching the development of this season?
I think there's one player just based off of preseason and how that's going to translate to the regular season. If I had to choose one, I'm going to choose Miles Bridges as a playmaker. I think he's going to be an interesting piece this year. He's a very good rebounder, so you got that going for him. He's always had a pretty loose handle in terms of just losing the ball, turnovers. So JB's obviously trusting these players to grab the ball and go up the court. He has been a playmaker in the half court this preseason, and I've seen him play out of pick and rolls and make some pocket passes to Biz or whoever the big may be coming out of the roll. That is something that like we rarely saw in previous seasons with Bridges. So if I had to kind of narrow it down to one key player and one development piece, that would be it. Bridges as a playmaker. Now, there's one other one that I'm keeping my eye on as well, is just Devontae Graham developing a game inside the arc, because last season he did not have a game inside the 3-point line. So he's been working on his floater, working on his mid-range, and finishing around the rim as well. So those two players, those are going to be big development pieces. And then there's a whole lot more storylines with this Hornets team, and it's a very deep, I guess, if you want to call it. There's going to be a lot of competition for a lot of different spots, and minutes are going to be hard to come by, whether it's with Monk or the Martin twins or McDaniels. So a lot of different storylines going into the season. They're always going to be, interesting to kind of take a look at, but Miles Bridges as a playmaker is probably the one that I'm looking at the most.
No, I think those 2 points are super instructive for Hornets fans that are going to be watching the team this year. Pay attention to how Miles Bridges is developing as a ball handler and a playmaker, and pay attention to if Devontae Graham can kind of make that next step in his offensive development, which would be figuring out how to effectively score when he's in the lane and when he's in the paint, kind of against the bigger defenders in the NBA. Yeah, I think, like you said, there's multiple storylines to watch, but those two are really important. And I also have loved how Miles Bridges seems to have embraced his role right now in the second unit. Like, I think that would have been easy for him to maybe be a little bit sour on that because he has basically been a starter since he's been in the NBA. He seems to like come off the bench with fire in his eyes, ready to go. And I love that. I really do. And like you said, he's been a terrific rebounder and he's showed a little bit more playmaking, which is important. Richie, I can't thank you enough. I know the season is with the season starting, it's grueling on your schedule. Thanks for spending some time with the Which Carolina podcast. Can you just tell our audience, where they can find you on Twitter and how they can find the Buzz Beat Pod and all that good stuff?
Well, first off, I appreciate the invite. I always enjoy talking about the Hornets. You can follow me on Twitter at Richie Randall. That's RICHIERANDALL. I tweet videos. And like I mentioned at the top of this podcast, I've been invited for some media availability. So you'll see me kind of tweet out some quotes and some of those pressers as well. Buzzbeat, we release a podcast basically every week, depending on our schedules, but it typically comes out on Wednesdays. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us, guys. We try to do our best, and I feel like we kind of give a balanced and fair analysis of this Charlotte Hornets team.
Yeah, cannot recommend the Buzzbeat Pod enough, and definitely follow Richie on Twitter because you'll get some of that media access, video stuff, and just kind of observations about the game. They're always informative. Thanks again, Richie. This has been the Which Carolina podcast. Night, everybody.